Guerrillas file out of the bush as part of the ceasefire in Rhodesia. After 7 years of armed struggle for black majority rule, they're now gathering in assembly areas run by British troops of the ceasefire monitoring force. And they'll stay there until Rhodesians themselves decide the issue with votes, not force of arms. The Rhodesian logjam really began to break up in December, when the three major parties to the dispute met in Lancaster House in London. For the Patriotic Front guerrilla alliance, Robert Mugabe signed with his co-leader Joshua Nkomo. Signing for Britain, Sir Ian Gilmore, Deputy Foreign Secretary, and Lord Carrington, the convener of the conference. The agreement was considered a triumph for Lord Carrington and his often tough-minded negotiating tactics. On his right, Bishop Abel Muzarewa. For Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, the settlement would hopefully lead Southern Rhodesia from the reimposed status of British colony to independent, self-governing Zimbabwe within 3 months. But would the goodwill at the signing hold through the ceasefire and a potentially bitter election campaign? For Bishop Muzarewa, the struggle was on to regain the premiership and the political ascendancy which the Lancaster House Accord had taken from him.
I do in no way wish to appear pessimistic. Let me assure everyone that with the correct leadership, Zimbabwe will flourish. It is one of the few countries in Africa, indeed the world, with the capacity for unlimited and unprecedented economic and social growth. I am hopeful and confident that with God's help, we shall overcome.
He said, in fact, that if we don't win the elections,
for
Zimbabwe
Robert Mugabe,
will be
the main task was now the reconstruction of Zimbabwe.
If they don't win elections, it means we shall have won those elections, and Zimbabwe will be reconstructed. Zimbabwe will be placed on a more democratic basis than the present basis. There will be equality, there will be non-racialism, there will be constructive policies.
Joshua Nkomo declared after the signing that he was going home, but the agreement was a time of mixed emotions.
The main emotion was, why did it take so long? Why did we have to lose so many lives? Why did we have to spill so much blood? Why did we have so much property destroyed? All because of a few people with little foresight, and that made me feel sad, but happy that at last we have been able to push the message across. But the price for that message was very, very high indeed.
For people in the streets of Salisbury, the capital, the agreement and ceasefire meant an end to UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. Britain's Premier at the time, Harold Wilson, predicted the rebellion by white Rhodesians would end in weeks rather than months. But the country had held out for 14 years against internationally imposed economic sanctions and universal condemnation. It was Prime Minister Ian Smith's Rhodesia Front government which proclaimed UDI on November the 11th, 1965. Over the years, his government had given only limited power to the black majority as international pressure increased and the war against the black guerrillas grew more bloody. Ian Smith concluded an internal settlement with black political forces led by Bishop Muzarewa in April 1979. The new constitution was unacceptable to the Patriotic Front, however, and the war continued until the Lancaster House ceasefire agreement. In its last sitting, the Zimbabwe-Rhodesia Parliament debated the constitutional amendment bill, which ended the rebellion of Ian Smith and the white Rhodesians. In his final act as Zimbabwe-Rhodesian president, Mr. Gumede signed the bill into law, dissolving Parliament, the Constitution, and his own job. It was perhaps ironic that this ceremony took place under the watchful stare of Cecil Rhodes, the founder of white settlement. Now, over 100 years later, he looked down on the final dissolution of white political power. The new British governor, Lord Soames, arrived at Government House 14 years, 1 month and 1 day after UDI to briefly reimpose British rule. To welcome him were a small group of white Rhodesians staunchly demonstrating their loyalty to the crown. One of the first acts of the new governor was to address the nation on Rhodesian television and to call on the people to support him through the ceasefire and the run-up to the election.
Good evening. The prospect of peace opens up at last for Rhodesia. The Lancaster House Agreement was signed in London today. Let us greet the news with joy. Let us grasp the chance. Let us all, each in his own way, dedicate ourselves to achieving a ceasefire and to building on truly democratic foundations a lasting peace, a prosperous country, and a happier way of life for all.
As part of the ceasefire agreement, American transport aircraft flew in the equipment of the 1,200-man British and Commonwealth Monitoring Force. Units from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Kenya and Fiji arrived at Salisbury Airport to oversee the ceasefire and organize the assembly areas where the guerrilla forces would gather. They brought with them their own transport to supply and get to the assembly areas. As Rhodesian troops looked on, the forces unloaded the trucks marked with a distinctive large white cross. On arrival at their bases, the Commonwealth troops are briefed on their role during the ceasefire.
We have an armoury which is over there. You will be shown, and your arms will be kept in there for safe custody while you are here, while you do not require them. Please
the
make
atmosphere
sure
was
that you
relaxed, but the troops have no real enforcement power.
So
They're restrained by the Lancaster House Agreement anyway, but they're lightly armed, and they'd be hard pushed to separate two warring factions. These British troops were settling in prior to moving out to the assigned assembly points. Under pressure from the Patriotic Front, the largely white monitoring force was enlarged to include men from countries sympathetic to the front. Britain is still by far the largest contributor with 700 men. They're the governor's link, with which he can judge the success of the ceasefire in the countryside. He paid them an informal visit before they moved out.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Nice. Not quite the same as Scotland.
Lord Soames has spent a considerable time with the monitoring forces in the bush, boosting their morale for what he concedes is a very difficult job. With these troops confined to a supervisory role, the governor has been criticised for using Rhodesian security forces and Bishop Wazarewa's auxiliary troops to track down guerrillas who have not abided by the ceasefire conditions. Lord Soames has been described as a bluff-mannered man with a taste for fine wine and fast horses, but with no real African experience. He sees his role as getting his job done on time and then pulling out. But it's too early to say whether progress in the ceasefire will allow him to do that.
Come on, gentlemen.
While the governor had tea with his monitoring force, the co-leader of the Patriotic Front, Robert Mugabe, returned from London to talk to his own Zanla forces at one of their bases in Mozambique. Mugabe's Zanla forces operating from Mozambique bases claim to have been more active than Nkomo's Zipra forces in the struggle in Rhodesia. Robert Mugabe came to inform them of the ceasefire arrangements and the assembly points to which they would be moving. Although both military forces of Zanla and Zipra and their political wings, ZANU and ZAPU, combined to operate as the Patriotic Front, they've now decided to work independently once again. Robert Mugabe and the bulk of his Zanla forces belong to the Shona tribe, who form some 80% of the population. Joshua Nkomo and his Zipra forces belong to the minority Ndebele tribe. The more radical Mugabe is also more concerned about the operation of the ceasefire than the more pragmatic Nkomo. He has been accused of withholding the best of his troops in the bush. In accord with the ceasefire provisions, some of Mugabe's guerrilla commanders did return to Salisbury and got a rapturous welcome. 84 senior officers of Mugabe and Nkomo's forces were greeted by tens of thousands of jubilant supporters. Many of them had waited all day in the blistering sun, reveling in the apparent success of the guerrillas' long struggle in the bush. The raucous demonstrations were both a sign of the guerrillas' broad-based popular support and a reminder of the volatile emotions that still threaten the fragile truce. At this demonstration, the police used dogs and tear gas to contain the crowd. Peace was not achieved easily after the long and savage civil war. In the first week following the ceasefire, 80 Rhodesians were killed in sporadic skirmishes between guerrillas and Salisbury security forces. But it was not merely the actions of the Rhodesian security forces which concerned Robert Mugabe. He drew attention to the presence of 250 South African troops in Rhodesia guarding the Bight Bridge. He criticised Lord Soames for not ordering them to leave and stated that they were a threat to the settlement.
Once elections are held and the people vote us into government, which they will do, Britain then leaves the country, then we come face to face with South Africa. And in those circumstances, you see, South Africa can easily move to surround our assembly points and surround our forces, therefore. You see, they are away from their bases and naturally must be in a defensive position. South Africa will be in an offensive position. They have already expressed their fear that we might win the elections, and their intentions that if we do, then naturally they would have to act. So they have said so.
Because of suspicions concerning the ceasefire, the assembly points along the Mozambique border saw the entry of few guerrillas from Mugabe's Zanla forces in the first few days. But once they gained in confidence that the ceasefire would hold, they began to emerge from the bush in small bands. The slow response to the ceasefire worried the monitoring officials, but Lord Soames refused to extend the deadline. Finally, towards the end of the 7-day period, Zanla troops bust into the assembly points in much greater numbers. But there was a suspicion that not all those who presented themselves were battle-hardened guerrillas. Mugabe was accused of sending forward teenagers and supporters in crisp new military uniforms to make up the numbers at the assembly points while holding back his regulars. Guerrilla commanders concede that many of their troops are young, in their teens or early 20s, undisciplined and unwilling to end the war before government forces have been decisively beaten. Some observers also believe that the guerrillas will not accept any other result than a victory for their politicians in the coming elections. Some units have buried their guns in the bush for possible future use. Zanla units in particular have shown great distrust of the assembly points, and groups have moved outside to form their own compounds. In the north of Rhodesia, near the Zambia border, members of Joshua Nkomo's Zipra forces were quicker to respond to the ceasefire conditions. They came in large groups from their Zambian bases. The core of both guerrilla forces are now potent fighting machines. In the early days of the war, they used to cross the Zambezi River in dugout canoes with rusty shotguns and hunting rifles to make hit-and-run raids. But in recent years, they've received Soviet and Chinese training and are equipped with Soviet Kalashnikov automatic rifles, portable anti-aircraft missiles, and other sophisticated weapons. The trust of the guerrillas had to be gained by the monitoring forces in the camps so that they felt confident enough to hand over their weaponry. One way of establishing trust was the dispensing of first aid to the wounded. The chief complaint was sore feet. The main task was then to keep the guerrillas occupied through the long weeks until after the February elections. Despite a developing rapport with the monitoring force, the Zipra forces in the camp still insisted on posting their own guards on the camp's perimeter. While Nkomo's military forces waited in the assembly areas, his political wing, ZAPU, held its first legal campaign, meeting in the streets of Salisbury. Many observers felt the decision of ZANU and ZAPU to contest the elections separately would diminish the chances of a Patriotic Front victory. So in order to gain the widest possible appeal, Mr. Nkomo has now decided that ZAPU will contest the election as the Patriotic Front party. Supporters are confident that he will draw support from beyond his own tribe as the recognized father of Zimbabwean nationalism. This initial election meeting was a foretaste of the battle for power, which acquired new momentum with the arrival back in Rhodesia of Mr. Nkomo. He chose the Black Township of Pineford to which to make his opening address. Trainloads of supporters travelled up from Bulawayo, the country's second city and his principal political base, to give him a tumultuous reception. For the election campaign, Nkomo has toned down the socialistic platform he emphasised during the years of guerrilla warfare. Instead, he appeals for reconciliation and a non-racial Zimbabwe. Nkomo is a personal friend of British industrialist Tiny Roving, and it is believed that support for his party may be coming from large Western multinationals as well as the Eastern Bloc. This is the third major force contesting the forthcoming election. Bishop Muzarewa's UANC party. There was a carnival atmosphere for the party's first mass campaign meeting. Bishop Muzarewa's supporters were determined not to be outdone in the contest to show who could command the greatest popular support. The bishop was running hard even whilst the Lancaster House talks were in session. For even though the UANC gained power in the internal settlement of April last year, it was unable to effect major changes in the country's political and economic system. This was chiefly due to the new constitution, which kept considerable power in the hands of the country's white minority. On top of this, the UANC is not united, plagued by ethnic rivalries. These political handicaps have helped in weakening Muzarewa's position and tended to increase support for the Patriotic Front parties. An indication of a possible Patriotic Front victory came in the elections of April last year, which brought the UANC to power. They recorded a very low poll in key Shona tribal areas. So, despite this massive gathering, the bishop is thought to lack real depth to his electoral support. Bishop Mugabe seeks to increase his popular appeal, he may receive a political present he could do without. It is believed that Mr. Ian Smith's White Rhodesian Front are likely to pledge him their support. They fear a victory by either Mr. Nkomo or Mr. Mugabe. Such white support would scare off many of Bishop Mugabe's African voters. While the election campaigns get into full swing, the settlement also promises a period of newfound prosperity for Rhodesia. The lifting of international economic sanctions has brought the return of foreign companies to Salisbury to trade. Exports have been badly hit by sanctions, although some of the output was getting through in disguise. Rhodesia is potentially one of Africa's richest countries, with agricultural and mineral resources. Until now, most wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the white minority. In black townships, such as this one outside Salisbury, the disparity in the standard of living between the white and black Rhodesian is graphically illustrated. These townships have also been swollen by the influx of Africans fleeing the war in the bush. And unemployment in these urban areas rose sharply as the economy was increasingly geared to the conflict. Traditional black employments and businesses suffered badly. Small shopkeeping, family hotels and little bus companies all have declined. Many African businesses were bombed or burned to the ground. But it's outside the urban areas where the burning issue of Rhodesia's future is to be found. The white minority of 260,000 own the same amount of land as the remaining 7 million Africans. In addition, the African majority is banished to largely infertile land. Most farmers in the tribal trust lands have plots too small to support their families. White ownership of land has until now been the basis for white dominance of Rhodesia's economy and politics, and wealthy farmers were a frequent target of guerrilla attacks. Under pressure from the guerrillas, white farms became fortresses, equipped with guns, barbed wire, and emergency radio links.
Control, control. This is Oscar Charlie 48. How do you read? 5, reading you 5s. This is just a test call. All well, all safe. Over to you. Thank you.
The Lancaster House Agreement may have removed white political power, but the white farmers still have their land, whose profits account for 23% of the whole of the Rhodesian economy. How would they respond to an electoral victory by the Patriotic Front?
Well, this is one we'll have to wait and see. Not there's apprehension about what the political future is going to be anyway, regardless of who wins. We often get this question, what happens if the PF come into power with their stated land policy of nationalisation. I think we'll have to wait and see what happens. If they don't nationalise, I would imagine that the majority of farmers will carry on and give it a chance and see what happens. I don't think there'll be any panic rushing out or trying to quit or sell farms or anything of this nature. I think it'll be just a case of let's see what happens. We've got a new government, we must give them a chance. We are possibly the most important sector within the whole economic life of this country. So we've got that as a backup, as a strength, and I think we'll play those kind of cards first.
Some white farmers, however, have not remained on their land. This is the Mozambique border area, which saw the heaviest guerrilla infiltration. With hit-and-run raids on isolated farms, many of the whites packed up and moved to the cities or emigrated. They left their tennis courts and swimming pools, and the land was allowed to revert to nature. By April 1979, it was reported that 2,000 white farms had been abandoned, and nearly 3 million hectares of land lay empty. In the same area is another spot bearing witness to the war's savagery. In June 1978, the Elim Pentecostal Church Mission School near Umtali was attacked. 12 Britons, including 4 children, were hacked and battered to death. Mugabe's guerrillas were accused, but he denied the charge, claiming the bodies left on the football field had been murdered by Rhodesian security forces. With the ceasefire, Rhodesian security forces are now preparing to open up the border with Mozambique. Over 200,000 refugees are expected to flood back into Rhodesia in the wake of the ceasefire. But first, the roads and the railway lines have to be cleared of mines. During the conflict, the guerrillas managed to achieve control over vast areas of land. Despite the endeavours to return to normality in the country, clashes are still reported between the security forces and guerrilla bands who have not gone back into the assembly areas. A young private of Rhodesia's security forces is buried. Like many of the 5,000-strong regular army, he was black. He's one of 1,800 Rhodesians who have died since the Lancaster House talks began, and the killing still continues. Over 1,000 members of the security forces have been killed in the 7 years of conflict. Most of the victims belong to the black forces in the field of both sides, with fewer casualties among white Rhodesian officers and civilians. The war cost a total of 20,000 lives, most of them guerrillas. Coupled with the enormous economic damage and social upheaval, it's been a huge price to pay. Rhodesians, black and white, are wondering how many more accounts there will be to settle before Zimbabwe finally achieves its independence.